put your name, institution and role title in the chat for us, just so that we have an idea of who's on the call. This session is hosted by the Equal Group. I'm very, very pleased to have them on board. So great, we've got Asha from Gloucester, Daya from De Montfort, Sophie from Worcester, hello. Oh, they're coming through really fast. Hello, Matt, how are you? Harry, Sam, loads and loads of people, great stuff. So just a reminder to everyone in the room, all these sessions are being recorded via our platform, so they will be available via the website. So you'll be able to log back in and replay any of the sessions across the week as you wish at your own leisure. I'm sure you'll all be doing that on Saturday night rather than watching The Voice. Just remember, please let us know your feedback using the hashtag SU20Digital. This is the final day, so it would be great to get feedback, good and bad. Next week, we will send out something for you guys to feedback on and let us know whether you would be interested in more of these events. So just a quick review of who we've got in the room. Hello, Tish again, Amina, Carolina, Heather, Laura, Jackie, Runcie, KT, Sarah, great stuff. So thank you all for joining us. We will kick off. So it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce Mac from the Equal Group. It's fair to say that they are, experts in the. It is with great in the workplace. And they're committed to optimizing equality, diversity and inclusion efforts within the workplace. They've got some really interesting work that they do. I have to say it's well worth signing up for their insight email because that certainly helps. But I will stop the sales pitch because I will hand over to Mac, who I'm sure will take us through his session. So as always, sorry, Mac, just as a reminder to everyone, if they've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A in the chat. Sorry, I'm the worst host ever. Over to you, Mac, sorry.
Thank you so much. Good morning all, thank you for attending today's session. Essentially it's on Black Lives Matter and how to talk about race in the workplace. Hoping that this session will be quite informative and insightful and essentially give you a little bit of a framework for how to apply what we've talked about today. So as has been said, I'm Mac, I'm the CEO of the Equal Group. Essentially we're a data-driven equality, diversity and inclusion organization. My background is in the energy industry, so specifically economic regulation. I spent 10 years as a regulatory consultant, working for the likes of KPMG, National Grid, and the UK and Scottish governments. My work over the years really focused on price controls and leveraging the power of data in order to determine how organizations operate over 5, 10, 15 years into the future. And this level of data analytics is the approach that we take to equality, diversity and inclusion, essentially using robust qualitative and quantitative data to demonstrate the relative success or failure of any interventions that we make. So hopefully this slide will work. Yep. So essentially I'll start by giving you a brief introduction as to who we are. I'll then talk a little bit about our approach and walk through the framework that we have developed around navigating issues of race within the workplace. I'll reserve a little bit of time at the end as well for questions. As has been said, feel free to use the chat and the QA function to get through any comments or questions that you have. So before I start, it's very important for me that I take this opportunity to clearly state that Black Lives Matter. It's not a question, it's not up for debate, it's a fact. And if you don't agree with the statement, you're probably not going to like the rest of this presentation. So you're very welcome to leave, to exit, or to get on with the rest of your day. With that being said, I will give you a little bit of context as to who we are. So the Equal Group was set up in order to help organisations really reap the tangible benefits of equality, diversity and inclusion. We understand that actually it can be quite a difficult journey, and our efforts are focused on making it as easy as possible for organisations to move from the analysis stage, i.e. problem identification, to implementation. So understanding what effective equality, diversity and inclusion strategies look like, and encouraging companies to continue to make progress in this regard. We're a data-driven company, so we focus on data first and foremost and allow interventions to feed off the back of every bit of data insight that we're able to gather, helping companies to get a little bit more visibility as to exactly what's going on within their organizations. So as an organization, we love an acronym, and the acronyms help us to ensure that the frameworks we put together are quite memorable. And today's framework is CURES. So looking at the context within which we are operating, understanding the history of race relations, the dynamics of race in society in general, and also specifically with relation to our sectors and the institutions that we work in. The next element of the framework is understanding. So considering the data that is before us, understanding the present day realities of the situation that we're in, and then also looking for the ways in which we can learn more about what's going on and being open to make mistakes as we journey along. The next element is about reflection. So understanding what the impact or implications are of what we say and what we do on a day-to-day basis and how those actions will be received. Establishing is the next part of the framework, which is about what we can do as individuals, what we can do as organizations, what we can do as a sector to really move forward and make the changes that we want to see. And the last element is about what it means to speak up. So when we are faced with problematic situations, when we're faced with issues of inequality or discrimination, what is it that we say and how do we respond? So everyone would have no doubt seen the Black Lives Matter protests and the social unrest on a global scale. And many would have understood it in the context of police brutality in the United States. But there would have been questions raised as to why it was relevant to talk about Black Lives Matter in the UK. And people essentially would have thought that the UK surely isn't as bad as the US. And whilst it's not relevant to make direct comparisons, it is worth noting that the UK has its own nuanced history of race relations. In 1968, the British MP Enoch Powell gave his infamous Rivers of Blood speech, essentially proclaiming the ills of immigration and promoting a suspicious attitude towards foreigners and an attitude of nationalism, essentially. Britain's also got a history of creating a so-called hostile environment, whether that be through overt pictures, posters on people's windows saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, or whether it's through more covert tactics such as the Home Office's immigration policies that were designed to target disproportionately immigrants from African, Caribbean, and Asian demographics. In recent times, we've also seen a prominent platform being given to known racists and those that push divisive views such as Katie Hopkins, Nick Griffin, and Nigel Farage. Interestingly, the UK was home to only one of a few anti-Black Lives Matter movement protests, whereby Tommy Robinson and the likes called on football hooligans to gather in Westminster to defend statues. So those kind of gatherings led to violent protests with police and the desecration of the statues that they were proclaiming to be protecting. So in short, the UK's relationship with race is very nuanced, at least. We've also seen in recent times the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 has had in relation to the BAME community. And you know, this, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement, is a constant reminder that actually, whilst progress on race relations is often promoted, we still have a long way to go to ensure that the principles of equality, being human rights, being available to every individual, regardless of your gender, ethnicity, physical or neurological impairment, or socioeconomic background, being aspirational to some elements of our community. Essentially, with the COVID-19, so Public Health England reported that Black men were 4 times more likely to die as compared to white men. And these issues were not biological. So they were a consequence of long-standing inequalities widely affecting BAME communities, looking at issues of racism, discrimination, and occupational risk. According to Liberty Investigates, BAME people in England were 54 times more likely to be fined for breaching coronavirus restrictions than white peers. The deaths of obviously George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the response on a global scale have demonstrated that we still have a really long way to go in terms of race relations. So the question we now must ask ourselves is where do we go from here? Where do we, as a society, move in order to unpick some of these inequalities that we're presented with on a daily basis? Now, it's easy for us to disconnect and get a little bit lost in the noise and point to the US as being a failed society, but really we need to look a little bit closer to home and understand that we have our own issues when it comes to race as a sector, and as organizations we face these issues on a daily basis. And it's prudent sometimes to hold a mirror up to ourselves and be critical of the data that's in front of us, understand what's happening from a diversity and inclusion perspective, and ask ourselves fundamentally, what is it like to work in the higher education sector for Black or BAME staff? So according to the UCEA, which is the Universities and Colleges Employers Association, Black non-UK men, Black UK women, and Black non-UK women suffer the most significant pay penalty when compared to white UK men. Additionally, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission found that during their inquiry into racial harassment in the higher education sector, that 50% of university staff described incidents of being ignored or
student leaders, or is this something you do ad hoc or part of your day-to-day dealings? So there's different ways depending on the type of student leader. As a link manager for a full-time officer, I very much put that as part of our one-to-ones. So I will say to them at the beginning of the year that part of the techniques I will use is coaching. I won't be coaching the entire time. Sometimes it's informational, sometimes it's we're working on things together. But I will tell them I'm using coaching techniques, and I will drip feed that in throughout the year as and when I think that the full-time officer needs it. For other student leaders, such as say committee members and part-time officers, if you have equivalent elected officers that are current students, I might do it as a session as part of their original training, or we do a leadership retreat where we get to focus on them a little bit more. So I would do an introduction as a full group, and then would get individuals to work in smaller groups with them. But that said, it also can be informal and ad hoc. Once you're kind of thinking about these things and thinking about the way that you ask questions, the way that you support students in this way, you'll find that any conversation you have with a student is influenced by it. If you think it's working, carry on doing it, and you'll see the responses to people. As I say, it can be ad hoc and a conversation in a corridor that sometimes has the biggest impact. Have I used these models to help student leaders empower those they have managed, e.g. presidents and VPs and volunteers? Yeah, I have. I think my whole principle of leadership within student unions is that it needs to cascade down, and you want your senior reps to be doing that for your say program level reps, and you want that to be happening within committees so that there are people coming on afterwards. I would probably, with the full-time officers, share models like this, so that when I'm getting them to work with their teams, they would have that. For maybe the engaged students, I might reference them briefly, but I would talk to them particularly about the questioning. I think that's a key thing that anybody can take away, is that for you as a student leader, and lots of our student leaders do this, they try and achieve everything themselves, and they risk burnout in doing so, and trying to get them to the idea of your impact can be so much greater if you are the influence of others. There's a saying that you're not a leader until you've developed a leader who's developed a leader, and that's what we're aiming for with all of our engaged students, that you have that succession onto different roles. A full-time officer, if they're just doing their job themselves and excelling in it, if they're not impacting upon others and there's no continuity for the following year, then there's a problem with that. So yeah, I would try and embed it in everything that you do. And you find that if you're doing sessions in a certain way and you're supporting them to then do sessions with their students in that way, that it does gradually cascade down, and it creates just an environment of coaching that students respond positively to. I'll share a couple more slides as I go through, but this is more for people to kind of look at if they want to before they go away. Again, the GROW model focuses on goal, which I think is an important thing to do. The reality, setting the scene, similar things have been covered like that as well. It ends up with the options, but it's the options that they just talk about, but then it focuses on them to do the action, what they will do. And you can break any of these models down with a lot more information. I'd say them being SMART goals is a key part of that. Loads of use of different questions that I'll give to you as part of the slides. And it makes you start to think about what, when you do a close question or something that we've all maybe started a meeting with, how are you getting on? Is everything going okay? And it's amazing how many times students, leaders will say that they are getting on okay, or they're fine, not too bad. And it hasn't really got to the root of the issue. Hopefully these questions on screen do that. So what we've looked at is strategies for meeting with student leaders in conversations. We've had a very brief overview of what coaching is, what its benefits are, particularly the solution-focused coaching and questions that we would ask, and a little bit about the models. I can put my contact details on the slides when we release them. So if anyone's got any questions after the session, they can ask then. I'll leave it open for another maybe minute or so for any more questions to come in here. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining this morning. And I hope that will be a benefit to you in the future. I'll put the references up on there as well. Thank you, Caroline. That may be a question for the conference organizer. I'm giving them the slides and I think they're making them available. I don't mind emailing them on to people if I can find them. So if I look at this chat, I'm sure I can find you from where you said you were, and I'll give that a go this morning. But for everyone, it should be available.
Into this a little bit later on in the presentation. Internalize, so at this level, BAME people or people from press groups internalize the messages about themselves and in essence adopt the dominant ideology. And this is typically reflected in the institutions and their experiences of disrespect from members of dominant groups. The negative messaging can result in people not feeling like they can bring their whole selves into the workplace or into institutions, and can result in people feeling significantly disengaged. At this level, it's important to note that actually a lot of the oppression is now transformative in that people within these groups self-regulate and enact the same level of microaggression and interaction on themselves and other members of the oppressed group. The institutional aspects finally demonstrate how organizations and systems can reinforce these ideologies. So it's a means through which racism becomes socially acceptable. And at this level, it's clearly embedded into society through laws, social structures, and access to resources and the provision of opportunities. When racism or oppression is institutionalized, it's a lot harder to identify, it's a lot harder to challenge and change. So in order to unpick this kind of systemic dynamic, it's important to challenge oppression at every single one of these levels. So having looked at kind of the context, we move into the next element of the framework, which is development of an understanding. And really it's about building on this historical and systemic context, and really looking at the current context and understanding exactly how issues of racism and structural oppression can be manifested, and identifying the areas where significant work is needed. Excuse me. So in recent times, we would have seen calls to decolonize the curriculum. And essentially this speaks to the inherently flawed way in which academic progress is measured. So typically, this has been through a fairly rigid Western lens. And in order to unpick some of this, we need to look at the ideologies which underpin the assumptions that we make about what is academically robust. Within this, we must be willing to embrace different voices, different ideologies, different philosophies, or at the very least acknowledge where there is a lack of diversity in terms of that dialogue. There's also a number of significant barriers to opportunity within the access to resources, access to opportunity, the intersections, so looking at the way in which class and race intersect, the way in which gender and race intersect, the way in which disability, either physical or neurological, intersect, and how that plays into our institutions and organizations. We must also look at the expectation that we have about individuals as well as groups of individuals. So in order to be more comfortable talking about race in the workplace, there needs to be a willingness to engage. And wanting to talk about race essentially means that you must be willing to learn, open to learn, and open to continuing to learn. It's not a static thing, it's a progressive thing. We also have to acknowledge that we won't necessarily get things right the first time, but with all things, the more you do it, the more comfortable you get. And I must stress that it can be quite exhausting for Black or BAME people to be constantly asked their views on race. So if you are in this space and you want to learn, there's a certain amount of responsibility that you have to take for your own learning. The burden should not be on Black or minority colleagues or students to educate you on the fundamentals of race. There are a number of resources available, both online and in print. So, you know, why I'm no longer talking to white people about race by Rennie Edo-Lodge. I'd also recommend Natives by Akala and The Good Immigrant by Nikesh Shukla. And lastly, you know, share what you've learned. So engage with white colleagues and white counterparts and encourage others to develop a similar understanding of racism. And the benefit of that will be that when you seek to implement change, you'll have support and there'll be other people that understand exactly where you're coming from. The next element is about reflection. So essentially it's about thinking before you speak or act. The focus here is on understanding that what you're trying to say or what you're trying to do isn't necessarily perceived or received in the way that you'd expect. So your intention might not be malicious, but you need to think further about the dynamics at play. So saying something potentially offensive to a junior colleague is potentially more detrimental based on them not feeling suitably empowered to speak up against it, or not even feeling that anything would be done as a result. If what you are going to say or do has even a small chance of being perceived as discriminatory, then don't do it. Discrimination in the workplace or in general is illegal under the Equalities Act. So be mindful that anything that you say or do could have legal ramifications. So we talked a little bit earlier on about microaggressions. I've included a couple of examples of microaggressions in the workplace, just to give a little bit more context as to what they are and how they can manifest. So commenting or saying to somebody, "No, where are you really from?" gives the suggestion that that person couldn't possibly be from the UK, and also gives the suggestion that they don't belong. Making race-based assumptions like all Black people can dance well, or all Black people like a particular type of music or an artist, is clearly inappropriate, and the same assumptions would never be made about a white counterpart. Stating that somebody speaks well for a Black person demonstrates your view that Black people in general don't speak well. And again, this is another race-based assumption. And finally, asking to touch somebody's hair is an example of minimizing somebody and making that person feel like a novelty, or as if their physical attributes are unusual in some way. Clearly, this is inappropriate behavior in the workplace. So having reflected on kind of what we say and do, hopefully we'll be in a position to be active and further look at kind of areas where we as individuals, as organizations, as a sector and as society in general can continue to fight racism. In observing the context, we can see that actually racism is quite active. It's manifested in words and actions and policies and procedures. Therefore, in order to fully embrace an active anti-racism dynamic, we need to be, really active in what we're doing. Anti-racism is defined as the policy or practice of opposing racism and promoting racial tolerance. But it's clear that we must be active in doing this. In terms of understanding the impact that we can make and the changes that we can make as individuals, as companies, and as a sector, we need to use the data and the experiences that are available to us. So looking at what impact we can have, what are the specific actions that we need to take, who needs to take them, and which groups are we aiming at. So understanding at every single level of interaction, what exactly needs to happen, what needs to be changed, and also being critical of the specific role that we play. So are we acting as an ally? Are we acting as a champion, a sponsor, a coach? Do we need to bring other people into the conversation? So these are all dynamics that we must really fully think through, excuse me, when broaching subjects of race. So the last element of the framework is about speaking out and speaking up. So being confronted with actions or words that could be deemed to be discriminatory or racist, as individuals, we must take a stand, and we must speak out, and we must be willing to say something. So this is a framework from the active bystander training, and essentially it looks at how we confront racism, or how we confront inequality or discrimination. So the first element is to speak up directly. So when we see an injustice or an inequality taking place, we need to be in a position where we can challenge somebody's words or actions as soon as we see it. So stating clearly, that's not right, or I don't like what you're doing, gives us the chance to really directly challenge exactly what's going on. The next element is delegation. So if there's somebody else that you can bring into that conversation, potentially somebody that's more superior, somebody that's in a leadership position, if you don't feel that you're suitably equipped to deal with what's going on. The next element is to distract. So understanding that not everybody is comfortable with direct confrontation. It might be a situation where you don't necessarily feel comfortable, or there's other things going on. So another option is to provide a distraction and move attention away from the situation, typically by changing the subject or providing something else for people to focus on. And then finally, it's about delaying. So if you don't necessarily feel comfortable right away in the immediate, there might be retroactive action that you can take. So delaying your intervention until you do feel comfortable or until there's other people around. But really the philosophy here is that we must all be active in challenging issues when we see things, either actions or words, that could be deemed as discriminatory or racist. So in summary, looking at the framework again, it's about looking at the context of racism, looking at the context of discrimination, understanding what we can appreciate about the history of racial relations, the dynamics of race in society in general, and specifically within our sectors and our institutions, because that's where we have the most element of control and influence. The next element is understanding. So considering the data that's in front of us, considering the implications of systemic and structural racism on the present day realities, looking at the way in which we can also learn and continue to learn about the dynamics of race. The next element is about reflection, so stopping to think what our individual actions or our individual words are contributing to the situation. Establishing is about looking at what our individual or organizational or sectoral responsibility or role is in changing the dynamic. And lastly, about speaking up as and when we see issues of discrimination or racism occur. So just some, I guess, discussion questions for you to take away. So it's about being open, it's about being aware, so understanding what BAME colleagues or students might be feeling at this time in relation to Black Lives Matter, in relation to the disproportionate impact of COVID on BAME communities, understanding the dynamics and understanding how we as a society either reflect or otherwise what the current situation is. And again, being active about what we can do going forward. So at this point, I'll hand back over to do some questions and answers.
Great stuff. Thanks, Matt. That's really, really interesting. Just wonder whether people do have any questions. I'm sure there will be a few. Please use the Q&A, raise your hand. There's a few different ways. You could even write it in the chat. Here we go. Just some feedback that says well structured and informative presentation. Thank you. Any questions? Here we go. How do we encourage those that don't see colour to engage in talking about race?
Good question. I seriously question people that say they don't see colour. I think to not see colour is a privilege. You know, I've had conversations with leaders over the last couple of weeks and months, and one of the conversations or one of the questions that I have when engaging with leaders is, you know, what point did you first become aware of race? And I say that because I know that a lot of white people, white men in particular, didn't necessarily become conscious of race until they were well into their late teens or early 20s. I, as a Black person, was first conscious of race at the age of about 3 or 4, when in the playground somebody made a comment about the color of my skin. So it's a privilege to not see race, and I think we need to to unpick that privilege and say, actually, you need to see race, because a lot of what we've talked about in terms of structural racism is based on race. You know, these inequalities are based on race, and your refusal to acknowledge race as being a thing and not seeing color is detrimental, because that essentially means that we can't have a constructive conversation about race. So anybody that doesn't see color, in my view, is really kind of what's the word? Really refusing to understand the problems that we're trying to tackle.
Great stuff. We've got loads of questions coming in. One from Sophie at Worcester. When encountering an incident, if you do change the subject, could that be perceived as ignoring the issue by the person or people affected?
It could. And I think it's the approach that kind of matters. And I think depending on the context, depending on the situation, I think sometimes if it's really kind of flagrant and really detrimental, it's important to then revisit it. So it's not about just changing the subject and ignoring that it happened. It's about changing the subject to remove the immediate threat, the immediate discomfort, and then revisiting the line of communication to say, actually, what you said was problematic, or raising it as a formal complaint, as you know, whatever's appropriate for the situation, really.
That's great. Another one here. You talked about how the academic curriculum is taught and seen through a Western lens. Unfortunately, most of the people setting this curriculum have gotten to that position through that lens and may not see the problem as easily. How would you approach this?
Yes, so for me, setting the curriculum is a function of leadership. And effective leadership is about dialogue. Effective leadership is about understanding those that you're leading. For me, equality, diversity, and inclusion sits at the heart of leadership. And I think for a long time, the academic space has been bereft of true leaders. I think we need to get into a situation where we're demanding that our leaders understand equality, diversity, and inclusion. And if you are in a leadership position, or if you are in a position to appoint leaders, you need to really be challenging the potential leaders in terms of what do they understand about equality, diversity, and inclusion? What do they understand about diverse and constructive curriculums? Because a lot of what we said about kind of the historical context of racism and structural racism is about this narrow-mindedness. And I think we can't afford to have that same narrow-minded view when we're talking about curriculums and when we're talking about educating future generations. So for me, the whole dialogue of opening up the curriculum is a function of effective leadership and speaks to the sustainability of institutions. So if you, as an institution, want to continue to thrive and want to continue to progress, you have to be in a situation to challenge the curriculum that you teach.
Great. Couple more loads of questions. It's fantastic. I'm just trying to synthesize them into some that perhaps cover a couple. There's definitely some stuff around challenging institutions and kind of you know, the white, stale and pale and male kind of leadership that often exists. How do we challenge microaggressions from the very top level? For example, belittling and undermining the views of Black staff.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think we need to cultivate environments where we can challenge. I think microaggressions have no place in the workplace. We need to make that clear. But I do understand that it can be hard when it's leaders that are perpetuating these things, leaders that are minimizing people's experiences, leaders that refuse to kind of acknowledge that people have a different lived experience from themselves. And that's why I spoke earlier about the need for leaders to really understand equality, diversity, and inclusion, and as leaders. So if you are a leader in the space, you need to make that time to really reflect on what your contribution is to the workplace, both in terms of your behaviors and in terms of what you say on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, there's a good question here about you know, almost changing the narrative from with senior leaders to see it as a political issue, to taking it into, you know, a real forensic approach to dealing with it. And I think that's a real challenge for institutions to grasp hold of and take on. I think that's probably more of a comment. But do you have any thoughts on how we challenge these kind of VCs at the very top to change the rhetoric away from it being a political issue?
It's an interesting one, because I feel like VCs for so long have not been challenged in any robust way. As I said previously, we as an organization focus on data, and data is the language that leaders should be looking to engage on, because data is undeniable in terms of both the qualitative and quantitative aspects of it. And it's about shaping the data as a basis or as a foundation to change. So we've seen recently the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the work that they've done in relation to race within, also racial harassment within higher education. Every VC, in my opinion, needs to be looking at that and understanding what their role is and what their contribution is to the sector. But again, it takes a true leader to do that. And I think, you know, VCs that aren't leaders, VCs that are simply managers or kind of in the role by virtue of being around for a long time, will struggle with that.
Yeah, I think that's very true. There's two questions here about how white people should support the movement, I suppose. And there's one that says, I feel bad for always turning up to BAME community events and activities to hear their views and ask their advice, but I'm concerned that I would never want to speak to anyone, speak on behalf of anyone. What would you recommend? And there's another one here that's probably quite linked to it. What are your thoughts on white staff leading on Black History Month? Any tips on how we might approach this? So I suppose there's two questions about how white allies can support the black conversation and around you know, profiling that in a better way without overstepping the mark.
Yeah, so I think the first question was about kind of speaking on other people's behalf. And I would ask what your role is. So I think sometimes it can be appropriate to speak on somebody's behalf, i.e. if they're not in the room, but then you need to use that opportunity to open up that room to say, actually, so-and-so or this individual or this group of individuals isn't represented in this room, and that is a problem. So using the opportunity to speak on somebody's behalf isn't a bad thing, but not using that same opportunity to open up the door and to make it clear that people should be in the room. So bringing in other people into that conversation should be the approach. The second part of the question, if I remember rightly, was on Black History Month and white colleagues taking a lead on Black History Month. I would question why. I think you wouldn't necessarily expect a man to take a lead on International Women's Day or International Women's Week or International Women's Month. In the same way, I wouldn't necessarily expect a white person to take a lead on Black History Month. I think there's an abundance of Black talent, an abundance of Black people that can articulate Black History Month and articulate things relating to Black history in a suitably credible way. So again, I would question the context. You know, why is it that you feel or the feeling is that Black people can't articulate themselves in that space?
Yeah, I think that's really relevant. And having come from working at a couple of institutions that have had that. I think it's really important to remove the barriers to allow people to be successful in that space. So, you know, if it's funding, there's probably a conversation about, you know, directing funding to support Black History Month better. Black staff and students, if they don't have the time to organise it, just trying to overcome some of those challenges, I suppose. Really, it is a precarious position for some people that really want to help, but I do think it's about having those conversations and not being frightened about it. If that helps to anyone. What else can we take here? How do we take the conversation that SUs are ahead of institutions, and how do we take that conversation forward, talking less about diversity and talking more about inclusivity or equity, because it seems like that's missing for a lot of institutions.
Yeah, so I think the starting point for me is about visibility of the issues around inclusion. So one of the services that we offer, not to turn this into a sales pitch, but just to using it as an example, is a equality, diversity, and inclusion audit, and that looks at both representation and inclusion. And what you find is that one follows the other, in that typically in organizations where representation is an issue, inclusion is a more significant issue. And it's about really digging deep into those insights to understand actually what is the lived experience of people that are potentially from underrepresented groups. Within that, you also need to acknowledge the intersections and understand that there is a compounding effect of inequality. So a female is disproportionately disadvantaged in relation to a male. A female of color is disproportionately disadvantaged in relation to a white female, and so on and so forth. When you look at kind of sexual orientation and disability and all of these other protected characteristics, and only a robust amount of data, both in terms of representation and inclusion, will give you that insight that you need to start challenging behaviors and systems and processes and procedures.
That's great. So we've got loads more questions. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to answer them all. Yeah, having hosted probably 20 sessions across the week, it's been by far the most interactive from a Q&A point of view. So thank you ever so much for everyone participating, and sorry we can't answer the rest of the questions.
Can I say if there are questions that you have, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or sign up for a consultation on our website, and I'll be happy to answer those questions. Yeah, and I would really encourage organisations to think about EDI assessments and EDI audits. I think they're a really good way that form a pathway for things to develop and for there to be a pipeline of activity and operations that can improve things. So finally, I just get the opportunity to thank you, Mac, again for coming in and talking, and thank everyone for their involvement in the presentation. So thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you all.